Hi guys, how you doing? Mr. K here. All right, we're going to be looking at the events, ideas, and themes um, from the 1960s up through the 2000s. Okay, it would be exceedingly helpful if you had your APUSH, the last chapters packet. All right, because I'm going to go essentially in the same way that this is laid out. All right, so let's take it away. All right, Stonewall Inn, June 28th. 1969. What happened? All right. To make a long story short, all right. Stonewall Inn was raided by the police. This had happened many times before, relatively speaking. That night, about 3 a.m., the police walk in. Apparently, they had every right to raid the Stonewall Inn because the Stonewall Inn was selling liquor without a license. But long story short, some patrons spill out into the streets, okay? The police sort of block them from re-entering the Stonewall Inn, and bottles begin to be thrown, and rocks begin to be thrown, and thus begins what becomes known as the Stonewall Riot. Stonewall Riot lasts about 6 days, okay? It grows bigger and bigger and bigger as each day goes by. This spot and what happened there, June 28th, 1969, is considered the beginning of the gay liberation movement. Okay. Long story short, all right, organizations, or an organization is formed out of this called the Gay Liberation Front. Let me just show you in the next few slides some pictures associated with Stonewall. Now, I do apologize. I know there's some ambient noise. This microphone is probably not the best. All right, just deal with it, please. I beg you. So let's go. And here you have a newspaper clipping. All right, police again, rout village youths. Outbreak by 400 follows near riot over raid. We'll keep going. Picture. Another picture. And another picture. A few days later, as it sort of coalesced into an actual protest. And more pictures. And more pictures. And why not more pictures? All right, Stonewall means fight back, smash gay oppression. Okay. Like I said, the Gay Liberation Front was founded out of Stonewall, the GLF. Should know that. And here you have another picture. Here you have another one. Stonewall, lesbian and gay rights are human rights. Okay. Now, there's a movie that came out about 5 years ago or so called Stonewall. I didn't think it was a great flick, all right, but feel free to watch it. You can make your own call on that, but it's about this moment and the importance therein. Here's another still from Stonewall, Christopher Street, Gay Liberation Day, 1970. And here's Stonewall today. If you notice on the right-hand side, sort of small, you can see a plaque. I believe it was President Obama a few years ago that designated that. And the park across the street, which is called Christopher Park, a National Historical Landmark. Hopefully you can see these. It just popped up. All right, U.S. Department of the Interior, National Park Service, Stonewall National Monument, Stonewall Inn, 53 Christopher Street at Stonewall Place. All right, site of the Stonewall riots, June 27th to 29th. The important event happened on the 28th, birth of the modern lesbian and gay rights liberation movement. All right, this is a picture of Harvey Milk. Harvey Milk was the first openly gay man elected in California. There's a really powerful film about this starring Sean Penn called, wait for it, Milk, about his life, all right, the struggles, the trials, the tribulations experienced by Harvey Milk and experienced by homosexuals in the 1970s, all right? It's a very powerful film. I believe he won Best Actor for it in 2008, maybe. Long story short, Harvey Milk and the mayor of San Francisco, a gentleman by the name of Moscone, are both murdered on November 27th, 1978 by a former board supervisor named Dan White, who has a very famous defense called the Twinkie defense. Look it up, okay? All right, changing gears. If you go to the back of the first page of your packet, you'll see it says New Professional Environmental Activist. This is a picture, if you can see it, I'm not sure, all right, but believe me, she's there, of Rachel Carson. Rachel Carson was an early environmentalist, all right, 1940s, 1950s, into the 1960s. In 1962, she publishes a book called Silent Spring, okay? Just to read you a quote very quickly of an experience she had. It says, "There was a strange stillness. The birds, for example, where had they gone? Many people spoke of them, puzzled and disturbed. The feeding stations in the backyards were deserted. The few birds seen anywhere were moribund. They trembled violently and could not fly. It was spring without voices," okay? What had happened was basically is that planes that were flying overhead were spraying DDT on the crops, all right? The birds were eating the crops, and they were being dramatically affected. Ultimately, this book... and the efforts that come with it leads to a DDT ban, all right? The substance that's sprayed on the crops respectively, all right? Also helps to create a professional environmental advocacy, if I can say that, movement, all right, involving lawyers, all right, involving all levels of government, okay? This is in the early to mid 1960s, Silent Spring, all right? Know that, 1962, Rachel Carson. There's more. All right, and here, I don't know if it popped up at all, but this is a New York Times article. If you can click on the hyperlink, awesome. If not, not a big deal. But it's from 2012, and it talks about the history of Silent Spring, the impact of Silent Spring, and how it helped, all right, to ignite the environmental movement. If you're thinking about synthesis in any way, shape, or form, in regard to environmentalism or environmentalist, all right, so you put Rachel Carson over here on the right. Think about in the middle, maybe TR, maybe John Muir, all right, in the early 20th century. And you can even bring that back to the transcendentalists in the 1840s and 50s and 60s, you know, Ralph Waldo Emerson, Henry David Thoreau, all right, the book Walden, etc., etc. Okay, all right, let's keep going. And just to kind of bring it to today, all right, this is Al Gore, and Al Gore in 2004 had a very popular documentary called An Inconvenient Truth about climate change. He won the Nobel Peace Prize for his work. Okay, and so again, if you're talking about synthesis, Rachel Carson in the 1960s, all right, TR and John Muir and Gifford Pinchot in the early 20th century, the Transcendentalists in the 1840s and 50s and 60s, and Al Gore in the early 21st century. All right, let's keep going. Okay. Again, I don't know if this worked well, if you could see it, but it doesn't really matter, okay, because over Al Gore pops up again a book that changed the world. Okay, here's a picture of Los Angeles in the early 1960s. If you notice, quite crowded. All right, there's no attempt to limit the emissions that are coming out of the cars. All right, this leads to a phenomenon known as smog. Okay, here's a picture of Manhattan in the 1970s, it looks like, because it looks like those are the Twin Towers right there. Early 1970s, I guess. Smog levels being very high at that time. This is a picture of Los Angeles. Around the same time, it would appear smog levels exceedingly high, all right? I think it's something like out of an average year of 365 days, 200 of those would be considered days with high smog levels in the 1960s and 70s, so something had to change. You have a young woman wearing an oxygen mask, all right, on one of those heavy smog days. We'll keep going. Say hi, and bye. All right, pollution was abundant, all right, in the 1950s and 1960s, with really no significant efforts to limit the output of said pollution. Here's a picture. Here's another picture. This is outside of Pittsburgh, you can see. And here's another picture of a smog-filled day in Los Angeles in the 1960s. And this is a picture of Birmingham, Alabama, near a plant that is expunging pollution, all right? Create these sort of hazy days that almost looked like night, all right? Birmingham, Alabama, pollution. And here you have a gentleman wearing a placard. It says, "Rest in Peace, 1990 AD." It's actually, the photograph is taken in 1970, so he's essentially making a statement that the planet will be dead in 20 years. Thankfully, he was wrong. And here you have a river, I believe it's the Cuyahoga River in Cincinnati, that caught fire. The reason why it caught fire in the 1960s a number of times is because of the level of pollution, namely oil. Okay, so something had to be done. Interestingly, one of the forces behind the environmental movement was President Richard Nixon, who in 1970, in his second State of the Union address, said this. I'll go quick. He said, "The great question of the 70s is, shall we surrender to our surroundings, or shall we make peace with nature and begin to make reparations for the damage we have done to our air, to our land, and to our water? Restoring nature to its natural state is a cause beyond party and beyond factions. It has become a common cause of all people of this country. It is a cause of particular concern, of course, to young Americans, because they, more than we, will reap the grim consequences of our failure to act on programs which are needed now if we are to prevent disaster later. Clean air, clean water, open spaces, these should once again be the birthright of every American. If we act now, they can be." Now, we still think of air as free, but clean air is not free, and neither is clean water. The price tag on pollution control is high. Through our years of past carelessness, we incurred a debt to nature, and now that debt is being called. Richard Nixon, 1970, State of the Union Address. So what does he do? Hold that thought. He helps and pushes forth and signs into law the creation of the Environmental Protection Agency, the EPA. The current director is Scott Pruitt. You can feel free to look up his name. All right, he's been in the news lately. All right, let's keep going. Here's a picture of a smoggy day over some major American city. All right. Interestingly, in 1970, really kind of chasing this feeling, you have the first, make note of it, Earth Day, 1970, all right? You also have, all right, signed by Richard Nixon, the Clean Air Act and the Clean Water Act, which set national standards for air and water, all right? So again, Richard Nixon, State of the Union, talking about the environment. Rachel Carson, Silent Spring, okay? 1970 is kind of a demarcation year. First Earth Day in April of 1970, know that, all right? And again, think of connections, all right? Past and present, all right, in regard to the environment. Let's keep going. All right, and here is a chart you can see of the number of days that air in the Bay Area violated federal ozone or smog standards, all right? And as you can see, 1969 was a doozy, all right? And it has fallen respectively 75, 80, 85, 90, 95, and only 2 days, 10 years ago of smoggy days in San Francisco, all right? Because of the efforts over the last 50 years or so. Let's keep going. All right, here you can see the progress in reducing ozone pollution, 76 to 2001, going down, down, down. All right, and here possibly, all right, if it's working correctly, whatever, stay with me, U.S. air pollutant emissions, 1970 to 2015, okay? Yeah, let's keep going. And here you have the ozone levels across the Los Angeles basin. All right, you can see in 1984 they were considered very unhealthy. All right, but strict environmental regulations have helped reduce the ozone levels. All right, and so it's relatively healthy now. All right, California today leads the way. All right, in terms of the environment. All right, in terms of emission standards, etc., etc. California. All right, let's keep going. And here we have 1968 and 2005. That's Los Angeles. Quite a difference, all right? Okay, so gay rights, the environment. All right, now let's talk about women. Now back to the first page of your, to shake this here, woo, APUSH, the last chapter's packet. All right, if you look below the impact of the gay liberation movement, again on the first page it says women's rights and the feminine mystique. Okay, so let's talk about women in the 1960s. Okay, this is a picture, if you can see it, of a woman named Betty Friedan. All right, and Betty Friedan is most famous because in 1963 she publishes a very famous book called The Feminine Mystique. All right, if you look here, it says the book we have been waiting for, the wisest, sanest, soundest, most understanding and compassionate treatment of contemporary American women's greatest problem, a triumph. Well, let me click again to see what happens. I don't know. Very famously, the book is about what Friedan calls it the problem that has no name. What could be the problem that has no name? Well, I will tell you in the next few slides. Stay tuned. So, just to give you a little background here, at this time in the 1960s, the National Women's Party was still around, although it was small, all right? It was still sort of trying to find some sort of new footing, you know, in the wake of women gaining the right to vote. Again, this is sort of a long discussion we've had over the course of the year. You know, we start with things like Abigail Adams way back when, and Republican motherhood around 1800, 1775 to 1800, into temperance, all right, and into abolitionism, and into the first women's rights movement in Seneca Falls, okay? That's 1848, all right, the Declaration of Sentiments, 1848. And then Susan B. Anthony in the 1870s. Remember when she voted illegally in 1872 for president? And gave that very impassioned speech from the dock, all right? And then before and during the First World War, Carrie Chapman Catt and the National American Women's Suffrage Association. And then breaking away from that is Alice Paul and other Quakers that formed the National Women's Party, okay? And then in 1920 is the culmination of this effort that first started state by state by state and then became a national movement to gain the right to vote, all right, using World War I as the final impetus. Well, then where do women go from there, all right? We talked about Rosie the Riveter in the 1940s, all right? But then the perception in the 1950s was essentially that Rosie went back into the kitchen, all right? It's not really true. It's far more complex, all right? But if you watch 1950s TV shows, that's how it's portrayed. But then again, there's an awakening. 1963, The Feminine Mystique. Here's the quote, all right, about the problem with no name, all right? I'll just read this by Betty Friedan. It says, "The problem lay buried, unspoken for many years in the minds of American women. It was a strange, stirring, a sense of dissatisfaction, a yearning that women suffered in the middle of the 20th century in the United States. Each suburban wife struggled with it alone. As she made the beds, shopped for groceries, matched slipcover material, ate peanut butter sandwiches with her children, chauffeured Cub Scouts and brownies, lay beside her husband at night, she was afraid to ask, even of herself, the silent question, is this all?" Betty Friedan went to Smith College, all right, classically trained. I believe I'm not sure if she graduated. Check my facts. She may have dropped out at 19 or 20 to get married very young, all right? And then as she has children, all right, and those children are growing up, she asks herself the question, is this all right? Is there more? All right, let's keep going. One more quote for you. Let me just read this very quickly, all right, from The Feminine Mystique, 1963. "The shores are strewn with the casualties of the feminine mystique. They did not give up their own education to put their husbands through college, and then, maybe against their own wishes, 10 or 15 years later, they were left in the lurch by divorce. The strongest were able to cope more or less well, but it wasn't that easy for a woman of 45 or 50 to move ahead in a profession and make a new life for herself and her children, and herself alone." All right, let me go forward one more. "And during President Kennedy's administration in 1963, he signs the Equal Pay Act, which, as the last chapter's packet says, barred the pervasive practice of paying women less than men for equal work." And hopefully this pops up. It may already be up, I'm not sure. There in the background lurking is LBJ. Okay, it says equal work deserves equal pay. That conversation, I apologize, is very prescient today about women, how much they're paid in comparison to men. You can look at different statistics and get different answers to that question, all right? But the conversation is still happening. A couple more things about this. Let's keep going. All right. Here you have, again, just showing the impact of the Equal Pay Act. It says American women's salaries have risen relative to men since the EPA's enactment, from about 62% of women's earnings in 1979 to about 80% in 2004, all right? But again, there's still work to be done. Okay? A couple other things here. You can see the slide. This slide has a line on it. That woman, if you can see her, is Gloria Steinem. All right, Gloria Steinem is a very famous activist and very active to this day. She was at the Women's March last year, 82 years old then, all right? The women's movement, all right, the feminist movement, women's liberation in the 60s and 70s, whatever you want to call that, had a slogan, all right? And that slogan goes something like this: "A woman needs a man like a fish needs a bicycle. It's also in a U2 song. A woman needs a man like a fish needs a bicycle. The point is, fish doesn't need a bicycle, and a woman doesn't need a man, all right, according to the slogan, all right? Out of this time period comes an organization called the National Organization for Women, or NOW, all right? It's become, like your packet says, the largest and most influential organization, all right, for women. Also at this time signed into law is Title IX, all right? You can see this. I believe I placed this in your packet. It might be on the back of the first page. You can flip over like I just did here, all right? It says Title IX established in 1972, and it states, quote, that no person in the U.S. shall, on the basis of sex, be excluded from participation in, be denied the benefits of, or be subjected to discrimination under any education program or activity receiving federal finance assistance. So we kind of default when we think about Title IX to thinking about sports and having parity in sports, but it's much more than that. And then there's the ERA, the Equal Rights Amendment. All right, it was actually first bantered about by women in the early 20th century, but it was introduced, all right, as an amendment to the Constitution in 1972. It did not pass, all right, for numerous reasons. Okay, but it's the idea that it's a civil right. It would be a civil rights amendment, respectively. All right, that says essentially that men and women must, in every respect, in every facet and phase of life, be treated fairly. It comes up on the docket every few years, the ERA, but it was first officially introduced in 1972 in this period of women's liberation, women's rights. And don't forget, like the gay liberation movement, even like tangentially like the environmental movement, women's movement is in many ways an outgrowth of the civil rights movement. If you want to find a synthesis there to kind of simplify it, many movements are women's rights in the 1840s and 50s is an outgrowth in some ways of the abolitionist movement. All right, so there's a nice connection there for you guys to think about. All right, let's keep going. Again, I apologize for the noise. My bad. Let's move on. Okay, if you can see this, all right. Gloria Steinem is also the founder of Ms. Magazine, all right. So Ms. instead of Mrs. Or Miss, all right. Ms. is kind of a hybrid therein, all right. 1971, Steinem founds Ms. Magazine. Okay, and just a quick but associated aside, in 1968, the Miss America pageant was in Atlantic City, New Jersey, okay, and it was famously protested, and I'll show you some pictures of protesters, mainly women, all right. Here's a picture here, and here you can see welcome to the Miss America cattle auction, all right, and a woman here who is basically separated into pieces of meat. 1968, the protest to the America pageant, all right, very famous moment there in women's history. All right, let's keep going. All right, here you have equality. The time is now. Again, these are sort of the daughters of the Rosies. These are the boomers, okay, taking to the streets. Don't be a clown. Take women seriously. All right, let's keep going. Here's another picture. Women need constitutional equality now. That's in support of an Equal Rights Amendment, all right, 1972. Let's keep going. This is Gloria Steinem in the last few years. For the same reason little kids say it's not fair. Let's keep going. All right, and maybe a nice synthesis would be to today, to the Me Too movement. All right, here's a picture of the Survivors March. All right, it happened to me too. All right, hashtag, I think that's a hashtag. I'm not really down with that, but Me Too, Survivors March. Here's another one, Me Too, Balance, Ton, I'm not sure. All right, but let's keep moving. All right, well, on the other side of the coin, hi guys. Say hi, Von Don. Okay, and Mike Gospodarczyk. All right. Very quickly, on the other side of the coin, this is Phyllis Schlafly, and Phyllis wrote a book in the 1960s called A Choice and Not an Echo. All right, she worked pretty tirelessly to stop the Equal Rights Amendment in the 1970s and 1980s, and was very effective. So Phyllis Schlafly, I believe she passed away 2 years ago in 2016. But she was a conservative voice, and believed that women would be better served if they were in the home and not out in the workforce. All right, let's keep going. Here's a picture of Phyllis right here. Stop the ERA, the Equal Rights Amendment, which it was stopped in 1982. Let's keep going. And I'm going to go forward here. Now, this birth control law of state nullified. This has to do with a 1962 court case involving Connecticut. I can't speak. I apologize. Von Don, take it away.
Griswold v. Connecticut.
Hold on. Griswold v. Connecticut. There's Estelle Griswold. All right, go ahead.
It held that a state law banning doctors from counseling women on contraceptive use was unconstitutional.
It did what?
It held that a state law banning doctors from counseling women on contraceptive use was unconstitutional.
Okay, so a state law banning doctors from counseling women on contraceptive use was deemed unconstitutional. Okay, thank you so much, folks. Let's keep going. This is a picture of labor activist Cesar Chavez. Now, Chavez spearheaded the organization of Chicano agricultural workers into what was called the United Farm Workers, the UFW, the first successful union of migrant workers. In 1965, there was a strike of grape pickers in the fields around Delano, California, and a nationwide boycott of grapes brought Chavez and the UFW into the media spotlight, okay? He was a lot like MLK in that he advocated nonviolent methods for achieving justice and achieving equality, part of what becomes known in the mid-60s as the Chicano Rebellion, okay? And here's a picture of that strike going on in California. And here's a picture, again, of that strike with the word strike in Spanish. And here is Cesar Chavez engaging in a hunger strike in 1968, which he did frequently throughout the mid to late 60s, even into the 1970s. Now here's a picture of Cesar Chavez on hunger strike, again, with Bobby Kennedy to his right. Kennedy was in California running to secure the California portion of the Democratic nomination for president. He would be killed about a week and a half after this photograph was taken. All right, Bobby Kennedy with Cesar Chavez. Now, this is a photograph of Dolores Huerta, and Dolores was also active in the Chicano movement and very close to Cesar Chavez, working with him hand in glove. She's still active today, still alive today. And here it is again, Hulaga. All right, Dolores Huerta. Dolores Huerta. Dolores Huerta. There's an Independent Lens, a PBS documentary all about her life. She's still very much active. And just two quick quotes that sort of summarize his approach. Cesar Chavez, it says, quote, "Nonviolence is not an action, it is not discussion, it is not for the timid or weak. Nonviolence is hard work, it is the willingness to sacrifice, it is the patience to win." And finally, the fight is never about grapes or lettuce, it is always about people. Okay. All right, well, here are two members of AIM, the American Indian Movement. All right, this is part of a broader movement termed the Red Power Movement, which began in 1972. All right. Now, in November of 1972, AIM, again the American Indian Movement, staged an event known as the Trail of Broken Treaties that culminated in a week-long occupation of the Bureau of Indian Affairs in Washington, D.C. They were emphasizing treaty violations, really rather than civil rights. All right. And then AIM insurgents moved to what's called the Pine Ridge Reservation, which was the site of the 1890 massacre at Wounded Knee, South Dakota. In the spring of 1973, they began a siege that lasted 10 weeks, about 71 days. AIM activists demanded the removal of the leader of the Oglala Lakota, whom they believed to be a corrupt puppet of the Bureau of Indian Affairs, and they wanted the restoration of treaty rights. Now, dozens of FBI agents then invaded under shoot-to-kill orders, leaving 2 Indians dead and an unknown number of casualties on both sides. Then the Red Power movement really culminated in what was called the Longest Walk, a 5-month protest that began in San Francisco and ended in D.C. in July of 1978. Now, this event emphasized the history of the forced removal of Indians from their homelands and protested the U.S. government's repeated violations of treaty rights. Now, by this time, several tribes had won in court by legislation or by what's called administrative fiat, all right, small parts of what had earlier been taken from them. All right, for example, the sacred Blue Lake was returned to the Pueblo Indians in New Mexico, and Alaskan natives were granted legal title to something like 40 million acres of land. The Native American Rights Fund, NARF, was established in 1971, all right, and gained thousands of additional acres, all right, in Atlantic coast states. But despite these victories, many tribal lands continued to suffer from industrial and governmental waste dumping and other commercial uses, and on reservations in urban areas as well, with heavy Indian concentrations, alcohol abuse, and ill health remain a serious problem. Here's Russell Means. He was one of the heads of the American Indian movement. He passed away in 2015. All right, kids, very quickly, let me go back here if this works. This is the election of 1972, and I have a special guest lecturer very quickly, Lawrence Florio Roberts. And I apologize for the ambient noise, all right, because period 2 is about to leave, and I have a near ride on my hands. All right, Lawrence, go!
All right, so this year is the election of 1972 between Richard Nixon from California and George McGovern from South Dakota. Richard Nixon ran a more conservative campaign, still appealing to the silent majority that brought him to his victory in 1968, while George McGovern ran a more liberal campaign. And there's also the first African American to try to win the nomination for Democratic President, Shirley Chisholm, but sadly she lost. And in this election, Richard Nixon ran a landslide. Won a landslide. He got all 49 states except for Massachusetts, which McGovern took.
Outstanding.
And this year will eventually lead to Watergate, which will repeal the electoral mandate that Richard Nixon gained in this election.
Outstanding, okay. Now, this is Richard Nixon in China, all right. In February of 1972, him and his wife, Pat, flew to Beijing, where they were greeted by the foreign minister, all right, Zhao Enlai, with a band playing the Star-Spangled Banner. All right. Now, early in his political career, Nixon had avidly supported an arch-conservative China lobby, but as president, he considered the People's Republic of China, founded in the late 40s, too important to be isolated by the West, and too obviously hostile to the Soviet Union to be discounted as a potential ally. Now, this was a momentous and surprising event, and one that marked a new era in East-West diplomacy. Now, Nixon claimed that he had succeeded in bridging, quote, 16,000 miles and 22 years of hostility, end quote. The president's move successfully increased diplomatic pressure on the Soviet Union, but simultaneously weakened the nationalist Chinese government in Taiwan, which now slipped into virtual diplomatic obscurity. This is Nixon at the Great Wall of China, pointing to possibly a bird. Hi, folks. How about Lawrence one more time for SALT 1? Go.
This here, SALT 1, was a limited nuclear arms treaty between Richard Nixon on your right and Leonid Brezhnev on your left. And this here was trying to limit nuclear arms so there would not be an arms race.
That's it? All right. Thank you. Okay, guys. How about Lawrence Florio Roberts? Ignore the announcement one more time. Lawrence,
all right,
take
this
it
here
away.
is the Warren Court. Now, Earl Warren was the Chief Justice for Brown versus Board of Education, and his court is rightly considered to be one of the high peaks of liberalism. And here are some of the decisions. So it's Baker versus Carr, that there is one man, one vote, and that forced states to reapportion districts to equally represent all people. Some of them hadn't reapportioned in decades, so cities with lots of people didn't have as much power as rural areas, so they had to reapportion it here.
Absolutely.
So this here came from
Yep.
Tennessee, Nashville, is where this came out of.
All right, 63. Keep going.
Then we have Gideon versus Wainwright. This year, it's every defendant must have a lawyer, even if the state has to provide one. This year came out of Florida, and it's the subject of Gideon's trumpet, which you can see on your right side. And that there was because he allegedly broke into something, and he was trying to defend himself, but he didn't do a very good job.
Okay, next one.
Then we have Escobedo versus Illinois. Everyone arrested by police must have access to a lawyer before questioning. And then we have Miranda versus Arizona, probably the most famous one, which says everyone must be advised of their rights upon arrest, including silence and a lawyer before questioning. These here are the famous Miranda rights. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say cannot be used against you in the court of law. You have the right to an attorney. If you cannot afford an attorney, one will be appointed to you. Do you understand these rights? And I think Mr. Ivanka had these rights read him at least 6 times in the past.
9 times. All right, thank you so much. All right. All right, here you have the Committee for the Re-election of the President. It was an organization formed in 1972 to re-elect Richard Nixon for a second term. Now, this went by the unfortunate acronym CREEP. They enjoyed a huge war chest and spent a good portion on dirty tricks designed to divide the Democrats and discredit them in the eyes of the voting public. The most ambitious plan, wiretapping the Democratic National Committee headquarters, backfired. Dun dun dun. Okay, now, picture it, June 17th, 1972, and a security team trips up a group of would-be intruders who were hired by CREEP to install listening devices in the Washington, D.C. Watergate apartment and office complex where the Democrats were headquartered. Now, The police arrested 5 men who were later found guilty of conspiracy and burglary. And although Richard Nixon claimed, or disclaimed, I should say, any knowledge of the plan, 2 Washington Post reporters, Bob Woodward and, of course, Carl Bernstein, followed a trail of evidence back to the nation's highest office. Here's Forrest Gump, again, entering history, reporting that break-in. Okay, now please ignore the hairdryer. Televised Senate hearings open to public revealed more than a pattern of presidential wrongdoing, and they showed an attempt to impede investigations of the Watergate case. Now, testifying before the committee, a former Nixon aide revealed the existence of secret tape recordings of conversations held in the Oval Office after Special Prosecutor Archibald Cox refused to allow Nixon to claim, quote, executive privilege and withhold the tapes. The president ordered Cox fired. This quote-unquote Saturday Night Massacre, as it came to be called, further, I should say, tarnished Nixon's reputation and swelled curiosity about the tapes. Now, on June 24th, 1974, the Supreme Court voted unanimously that Nixon had to release the tapes to a new special prosecutor, Leon Jaworski. And here you can see Nixon on the phone. Although incomplete, the Watergate tapes proved quite damning for Richard Nixon. They documented his ravings against his enemies, including anti-Semitic slurs and his conniving efforts to harass private citizens through federal agencies. Now, the tapes also proved that Nixon had not only known about plans to cover up the Watergate break-in, but had ordered it. The news media enjoyed a field day with the revelations. In July of 1974, the House Judiciary Committee adopted 3 articles of impeachment charging Nixon with obstructing justice. And here's a picture of Nixon's secretary showing how she, by accident, erased 18 minutes of conversations between Nixon and an aide. Now, charges of executive criminality had clouded the Nixon administration since his vice president had resigned in disgrace. In 1972, Spiro Agnew from Maryland had admitted accepting large kickbacks while serving as governor of that state. Pleading no contest to this and to charges of federal income tax evasion, Agnew had resigned from office in October of 1973. Gerald Ford, a moderate Republican representative from Michigan, had replaced him and now stood in the wings while the president's drama unfolded. Facing certain impeachment by the House of Representatives, Richard Milhous Nixon became on August 9, 1974, the first U.S. president to resign from office. Here you can see Nixon versus United States. The Supreme Court ruled in July that Nixon had to hand over all of the tapes, and some of the damning evidence that will lead to his resignation was on those tapes. Nixon versus United States. And so, in 1974, in August, Richard Nixon resigns, the only president to do so, rather than be impeached and removed from office. And here is Richard Nixon in deep thought, and just some newspaper headlines from that time. Nixon denies role in cover-up, and Nixon says he won't resign, and Nixon resigns, And of course, this elicits this very famous photograph here of Nixon standing outside of Marine One, and now in 1974, in August, Gerald Ford, his newly minted vice president, becomes president. All right. For this slide, we're going to have Audrey introduce it. So, Audrey, can you say the Ford custodianship?
The Ford custodianship.
Okay. Gerald Ford, was Nixon's vice president, his second vice president. All right, he takes over once Nixon resigns office. All right, he's going to be president for about 2.5 years, and he will lose to, Audrey, can you say Jimmy Carter?
Jimmy Carter.
Okay, so let's keep what? Yeah.
Hey, I hide under the blankets when I'm done talking.
Okay, that sounds good. Let's keep going. Again, guys, ignore the ambient noise. This is homeroom on Wednesday, but a real quick discussion about the 73 to 74 oil crisis. Lawrence, one more time, probably 2 more times, to take it away.
This here is oil crisis was in response to America's involvement in the Yom Kippur War, which is against Israel and a coalition of Arab nations, which produce oil called OPEC. Mm-hmm. So here,
OPEC stands for the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries. It's on your last chapter's packet. Go.
Yep. So then, So then in response to this, they raised the price of oil, and this here caused a disaster in America, because if you go, you can see right here, you can see gas shortages, 10 gallons of gas, they had rationing for gas, there's no gasoline. This here is a very famous picture right here. Then we have pumps closed all over because of the gasoline shortage. This here shows the long lines I got to wait in. I remember this here is almost as lines for Mr. Kravanka's lecture in the park.
That's a good point. All right, guys. Mr. Barbarotta, say hi.
Hey guys,
Okay.
Jimmy Carter. It's my president Evan Dobell, Trinity College, director of protocol for one Jimmy Carter. Extra credit on Mr. K's next test.
There you go. All right, Lauren, 76 election. All right, into the presidency. Go.
So Jimmy Carter, as you can see from these pictures, was a peanut farmer from Georgia, and he was also a born-again Christian and one-term governor of Georgia. In 1976, he won the Democratic nomination, and then he won the presidency partly because Gerald Ford was like a really bad president. Well, he didn't really do anything in
Good
had a
football
state of
player,
Nixon.
good football player.
And Jimmy Carter is one of the only good Democratic presidents.
Okay, how would you summarize very quickly his 4 years as president?
Jimmy Carter's 4 years as president. We're not very good because we have the Iran crisis. Well, of course, there are some high points like his protection of the environment at 3 Mile Nuclear Island and Camp David Accords.
Yeah.
But besides that, he wasn't a very good president because he trusted people too much and had some bad advisors. But he was a good person.
Lays in my heart. He wanted to really have sort of his legacy to be human rights, right?
Yes.
And whatever. Okay, so thank you so much. Now here's a picture of Jimmy Carter installing solar panels in the White House in 1976. Ronald Reagan removed those, but this highlights Carter's commitment to environmental causes. You can hear Jeopardy in the background. All right? Now, although Carter had a relatively short tenure as president, he nearly triumphed in the Middle East. Now, early in his administration, he met privately with Israeli Prime Minister Menachem Begin to encourage peace with Egypt. Now, when negotiations between the two countries stalled in 1978, Carter brought Begin together with Egyptian President Anwar Sadat, for a 13-day retreat at Camp David in Maryland. Now, the Camp David Accords, signed in September of 1978, they set the formal terms for peace in the region. Now, Egypt became the first Arab country to recognize Israel's right to exist, and the two nations established mutual diplomatic relations for the first time since the founding of Israel in 1948. In return, Egypt regained control of the Sinai Peninsula, including important oil fields and airfields. And in 1979, Begin and Sadat shared the Nobel Peace Prize. Okay. All right, in more history, all right, in December of 1979, 30,000 Soviet troops invaded Afghanistan, their neighbor to the south, and put down a revolt by Islamic fundamentalists, all right? The invasion succeeded mainly in heating up a civil war, all right, which the American press quickly labeled the, quote, Russian Vietnam. Now, as the war bogged down, Americans heard familiar stories, all right, this time of Soviet soldiers using drugs and expressing disillusionment with their government. Now, President Carter responded to these events with his own corollary to the Monroe Doctrine. Interesting, the so-called Carter Doctrine asserted the determination of the United States to protect its interests in yet another area of the world, the Persian Gulf. Now, Carter acted on the advice of Zbigniew Brzezinski, his national security advisor, who believed that the Soviet Union would soon try to secure for itself a warm water port on the Gulf, an area rich in oil and now vital to U.S. interests. Now, the president backed up his increasingly hardline policies by halting exports of grain and high technology to the Soviet Union, supporting Afghani resistance against the Russians, and finally by canceling American participation in the 1980 Moscow Olympics. And here you have, if you can see it, those Olympics without the United States participating. Okay, again, I apologize for Jeopardy on in the background, although it's a good episode. It's a picture of 3 Mile Island in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. On March 28, 1979, a series of mechanical problems and judgment errors at this nuclear facility led to the breakdown of the plant cooling system, causing the formation of a dangerous explosive hydrogen bubble and posing the danger of a catastrophic nuclear meltdown along the lines of Chernobyl in 1986. Now, after the news broke, nearly 150,000 residents fled their homes, and President Carter and his wife, First Lady Rosalind Carter, tried to reassure the community by visiting the site. 10 days later, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission announced that any danger of explosion had passed, all right, but what had seemed, all right, Audrey, hang on, an isolated event in one community had already grown into a regional phenomenon with national repercussions. Now, elevated levels of radioactivity were found in milk supplies several hundred miles away, and massive demonstrations against nuclear power followed the incident, concluding in a rally of more than 200,000 people in New York City. Now, groups organized in many communities to defeat referendums to fund new nuclear power facilities, or rallied around candidates who promised to shut down existing ones. Of the 96 under construction at that time, and the 30 more planned at the time of the TMI, the 3 Mile Island crisis, only a handful were completed. And here's a picture here. You can see the cooling towers in the background. And very quickly, here is a marker, all right, to the nuclear accident at 3 Mile Island, March 28th, 1979. Sort of turned the nation away from nuclear power. Okay, November 4, 1979, the Iranian hostage crisis, all right? On that date, Iranian fundamentalists seized the U.S. Embassy in Tehran and hold 52 Americans hostage for 444 days. This event makes Carter's previous problems look rather small by comparison. Now, for decades, all right, U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East had depended on a friendly government in Iran. Now, after the CIA had helped to overthrow the reformist constitutionally elected government of a gentleman by the name of Mossadegh, all right, they installed the Pahlavi, P-A-H-L-A-V-I royal family as the Shah in 1953, all right? And millions of US dollars poured into the Iranian economy and the Shah's armed forces. Now, President Carter had toasted the Shahs for his, quote, great leadership and overlooked the rampant corruption in government and a well-organized opposition among the Iranian populace. All right? Okay. But by early 1979, the revolution led by Islamic fundamentalist Ayatollah Khomeini, all right, had overthrown the Shah. Now, after Carter had allowed the deposed Shah to enter the U.S. for medical treatment, a group of Khomeini's followers retaliated, storming the U.S. Embassy and taking the American staff as hostages. Now, all right, Carter's Secretary of State, Cyrus Vance, assured Carter that only negotiations could free the Americans. Now, caught up in a re-election campaign and lobbied by Zbigniew Brzezinski, his national security advisor, for decisive action, all right, Carter ordered U.S. military forces to stage a nighttime helicopter rescue mission, but a sandstorm caused some of the aircraft to crash and burn, leaving 8 Americans dead. Their burned corpses displayed by the enraged Iranians. Short of an all-out attack, which surely would have resulted in the hostage's death, Carter had used up his options. The political and economic fallout was very heavy. Now, Cyrus Vance resigned, the first Secretary of State in 65 years to leave office over a political difference with the president. All right, the price of oil rose by 60%. Now, Carter had failed in the one area he had proclaimed central to the future of the U.S. Energy, all right? He had also violated his own human rights policy, which was intended to be his distinctive mark on American foreign affairs. Those hostages were freed the day that Carter steps down as president and Ronald Reagan is sworn in. It's a picture of Ronald Reagan, born 1911, raised in the small town of Dixon, Illinois. 1937, Reagan embarked on a Hollywood acting career that would last for a quarter century. A little bit later, he was the president of the Screen Actors Guild from 1947 to 1952. He was originally a New Dealer, but in the 1950s, Reagan begins to distance himself from New Deal liberalism by becoming the leader, or a leader, of the anti-communist forces in Hollywood. In 1954, Reagan became the host of a new national television program, General Electric Theater, and began a long stint as a national promoter for GE. Now, when Reagan enters the White House in January of 1981, his supporters confidently predicted that the Reagan Revolution would usher in a new age in American political life. Now, despite his narrow margin of victory, they interpreted his election as a popular mandate for the conservatism that had been growing since Nixon took office. And there is Reagan with his signature cowboy boots. Again, Reagan and his cowboy boots, and Reagan with his second wife, Nancy, probably wearing cowboy boots. A photograph of Ronald Reagan, right, taken in 1982. Ronald Reagan was able to tap into something called the New or Christian Right. In 1980, about 70 million Americans were claiming to be born-again Christians, all right? By the end of the 1970s into the 1980s, evangelical Christians had become really the backbone of the New Right movement, and they were chief fundraisers for key organizations such as the National Conservative Political Action Committee and most especially the Moral Majority. They united behind major conservative and political leaders, not merely to promote an ideology, but to target specific issues that they believed further undermined what they termed traditional family values. Now this here, if you can see him, is a photograph of the Reverend Jerry Falwell, who formed the Moral Majority in the late 1970s, really in the wake of the Roe versus Wade decision. All right, he was a televangelist. All right, became increasingly political as his sermons expanded in scope on his program called the Old Time Gospel Hour. Now, he declared a war against sin by opposing abortion and homosexual rights and pornography and crime, and by appealing for financial contributions, he generated an annual income of more than $100 million. Now, the Reverend Falwell reached his peak in the early 1980s and was at the time the most visible fundamentalist preacher in the United States. He again had a well-publicized campaigns against the Equal Rights Amendment and the busing of school children. Okay, and here is a quote from one of his sermons. Right? We are born into a war zone where the forces of God do battle with the forces of evil, and sometimes we get trapped, pinned down in the crossfire. And in the heart of that noisy, distracting battle, two voices call out for us to follow. Satan wants to lead us into death. God wants to lead us into life eternal. Here's a picture, if you can see it, of Falwell with President Reagan. Okay, now here's a photograph of Ronald Reagan with dog about to sign his Economic Recovery Tax Act of 1981. This is going to get a little bit wonky, but just bear with me here, all right? The Economic Recovery Tax Act of 81, all right, lowered income and corporate taxes by $747 billion over 5 years. For individuals, the act cut taxes across the board. It also reduced the maximum tax on all income from 70% to 50%. It lowered the maximum capital gains tax, the tax paid on profitable investments, from 28% to 20%, and eliminated the distinction between earned and unearned income. This last measure proved to be a boon for the small, richest fraction of the population that derives most of its income from rent and dividends and interest instead of from actual wages. Okay, the Economic Recovery Tax Act of 1981. Now, this is all part of, again, a conservative mode of thinking, conservative doctrine, what became known as Reaganomics. All right, here's a quote here. The Republican program for solving economic problems, Reagan once denounced, is based on growth and productivity. Now, during his presidency, he sought to revitalize the American economy by a strategy dubbed, again, Reaganomics, that was based on what's called supply side, if you make note, economic theory, in lashing out at the growing bureaucracy in government and simultaneously celebrating the achievement of entrepreneurs unfettered by government regulation or aid. His administration broke sharply with the Keynesian policies that had dominated since the New Deal era. Keynesian being essentially priming the pump, spending. Instead, Reaganomics simplistically is cut at the top, cut at the corporate level, all right, at the supply side, if you will. So this is also known as supply side economics, referred to in a negative sense by then candidate George Herbert Walker Bush, running against Ronald Reagan in 1980, as voodoo economics. Voodoo economics. All right, supply side economics, tax cuts. And here's a cartoon, corporate profits trickle down already. This is also, I forgot to mention, known as trickle down economics. The idea is if Companies are swelled with profits. They will release that money in certain ways to their workers, all right, who will then spend that summarily. And I guess this cartoon is saying that corporations are dammed up with those profits and it does not trickle down. So a cartoon in the negative in regard to support for Reaganomics or supply side economics or voodoo economics or trickle down economics, whatever you want to call it. That's the idea. Okay? Let's talk about the election of 1984. In the election of 1984, Ronald Reagan ran against Walter Mondale, all right, from Minnesota, a former senator. If you can see him, there he is right there. Now, Mondale had close ties with the party's liberal establishment and also the support of the more military-minded wing. And at the Democratic National Convention, Mondale named Representative, hopefully she will pop up here, Geraldine Ferraro from New York as his running mate, a first for a woman in American politics, the first vice presidential candidate who was a woman. All right, charismatic speakers such as Reverend Jesse Jackson, a dynamic disciple of Martin Luther King, and Governor Mario Cuomo of New York stirred the delegates and many television viewers with their appeals to compassion and fairness and brotherhood. Opinion polls showed Mondale running even with Reagan. But the president's enormous personal popularity, along with the booming economy by 1984, overwhelmed the Democratic ticket. Now, while Mondale emphasized the growing deficit and called attention to Americans who were left out of prosperity, Reagan cruised above it all. It was, quote, and here is a slogan, "Morning in America again," his campaign ads claimed. Now, he offered the voters a choice between a Democrat government of pessimism and fear and limits, or his own, based on hope and confidence and growth. And one of the biggest landslides in American history, Reagan won 59% of the popular vote and carried every state but, of course, Minnesota and the District of Columbia. Now, a majority of blue-collar voters cast their ballots for the president, as did 54% of women, despite Ferraro's presence on the Democratic ticket, right? And these Democrats who voted for Reagan get the name, quote, Reagan Democrats. Okay? Now, the 1980s are known for quite a number of things, all right? One of the things they're known for is money, all right? Punctuated by shows like Lifestyles of the Rich and Famous, all right? There's a very famous saying, kind of along the lines of the 1920s, good synthesis there, all right? That really the main objective of the decade was about making money. And it becomes known famously as the Me Decade, all right? The 1980s as the Me Decade, punctuated by, if you've ever seen the movie Wall Street, Gordon Gekko, who said greed is good, all right? It kind of simplistically defines the feeling, the zeitgeist of the 1980s, all right? The Me Decade, making money. So the hippie of the 1960s becomes the yuppie of the 1980s. In 1981, doctors in Los Angeles and San Francisco and New York began encountering a puzzling new medical phenomenon. Young homosexual men were dying suddenly from rare types of pneumonias and cancer. This underlying cause was found to be a mysterious new viral disease that destroyed the body's natural defenses against illness, making its victims susceptible to a host of opportunistic infections. Now, researchers at the CDC, the Centers for Disease Control in Atlanta, called the new disease the Acquired Immune Deficiency Syndrome, all right, AIDS. Now, originally it was called GRID, all right, gay-related immune disease. Now, the virus that causes AIDS is transmitted primarily in semen and blood. Now, full-blown AIDS might not appear for years after initial exposure to the virus. Thus, one could infect others without knowing one had the disease. Now, although tests emerged to determine whether one carried HIV, there was no cure. Now, the majority of early AIDS victims were homosexual men who had been infected, I should say, through sexual contact. Many Americans thus perceived AIDS as a disease of homosexuals, but other victims became infected through intravenous drug use, blood transfusions, heterosexual transmission, or birth to AIDS-carrying mothers. By 1990, nearly 160,000 Americans had contracted the disease, and nearly 100,000 had died from it, all right? This is a picture of, if you can see it, Rock Hudson, very famous Hollywood icon who in the mid-'80s goes public with the fact that he has HIV. He dies of AIDS quickly after that. The first celebrity, real celebrity, all right, to die of AIDS. And this is Ryan White. I was in 6th grade when he went public with his story. He had contracted, I should say, AIDS via blood transfusion. AIDS, of course, provoked fear and anguish and anger. All right. He was not allowed to go to school. He was not allowed to use the bathroom. All right. People were worried about his saliva, worried about whether or not they could get AIDS via a toilet seat. All right. But it also brought an upsurge of organization and political involvement. In city after city, the gay community responded to the AIDS crisis with energy and determination. Most gay men changed their sexual habits, practicing safe sex to lessen the chances of infection. The Reagan administration, playing to anti-homosexual prejudices, largely ignored the epidemic, only first acknowledging it in 1986, 4 years after it was declared a disease by the CDC. All right. Now, one important exception was Surgeon General C. Everett Koop, who urged a comprehensive sexual education program in the nation's schools. This is a picture in 1987 of what becomes known as the AIDS quilt. All right, in an effort to memorialize those that had lost their lives and to make people aware of the dangers of the disease. Here it is again more recently, every few years. In the end, every 10 years or so, the AIDS quilt is blanketed out across the lawn in front of the Washington Monument. In the early 1980s, the Reagan administration made vigorous anti-communistic rhetoric the centerpiece of its foreign policy. In a sharp turn from President Nixon's pursuit of détente and President Carter's focus on human rights, Reagan described the Soviet Union as, quote, an evil empire, the focus of evil in the modern world. Here is a fuller quote, if you can see it: to ignore the facts of history and the aggressive impulses of an evil empire, to simply call the arms race a giant misunderstanding and thereby remove yourself from the struggle between right and wrong, good and evil. In 1983, President Reagan introduced an unsettling new element into superpower relations when he presented his Strategic Defense Initiative, or SDI, the plan for a space-based ballistic defense system that journalists dubbed Star Wars, after the popular Hollywood films. This proposal for a 5-year, $26 billion program promised to give the U.S. the capacity to shoot down incoming missiles with laser beams and homing rockets. To critics, the plan seemed unworkable, impossibly expensive, and likely to destabilize existing arms treaties. The Reagan administration pressed ahead, spending $17 billion in research before President Reagan left office without achieving any conceivable results. Nevertheless, the Soviets viewed the SDI as an offensive strategy to ensure a first strike advantage to the U.S. The prospect, I should say, of meaningful arms control dimmed in this atmosphere, and U.S.-Soviet relations quickly deteriorated. Here is a graphic of what it may have looked like had it happened, all right? And like I mentioned previously, it was nicknamed by some Star Wars, if you can see that. Now, here are two pictures. One pictures of Mikhail Gorbachev, the Soviet premier. The other, of course, is of President Reagan. All right. If you know your history, you realize that it really is the steps taken by Gorbachev, more than Reagan, that leads to this easing of tension and the disintegration of the Cold War. Gorbachev spoke of ideas such as détente, all right, an easing of tension, or glasnost, which is an openness in Soviet society, okay? So it took maybe the duality of these two leaders, okay, to bring the Cold War, which at that point was closing in on 50 years, all right, to a close, to a conclusion. And of course, here is Reagan in front of, if you can see this, the Brandenburg Gate in 1987. Very famously, he says, "Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall." Now, interestingly, I was reading this recently. No one at the time in America seemed to care about that speech at all. The Soviets did care, and they didn't like it, but it didn't have the impact that we think it had today when we teach it, all right? It feels like when we talk about this 30 years later, he says, "Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall and it comes down overnight. It's not true. It's a more laborious process than that. But it's a famous snapshot of Reagan in front of the Brandenburg Gate. Moving quickly now, this is a picture of George Herbert Walker Bush. This is, of course, Ronald Reagan's vice president who runs for president in his own right in 1988. Okay, he runs against Governor of Massachusetts, Michael Dukakis. Dukakis will lose, all right, probably because of a number of things, but one of which is a very infamous photograph of him on top of a tank wearing a helmet. He was lampooned for that. The other is an infamous ad. The Bush administration worked hard to portray Michael Dukakis as weak on crime. All right, as governor, he supported a weekend furlough program. All right, and Willie Horton, who was an inmate, was allowed on a furlough and committed a sexual assault. And so this ad becomes one of the most infamous ads in American political history. It only ran once or twice, okay? But George Bush wins the election of 1988, sworn in January 20th, 1989. Now, the defining moment in George Bush's presidency, Bush the Elder, Bush 41, is the Gulf War, the Persian Gulf War. Now, on August 2nd, 1990, Iraqi troops, they sweep into neighboring Kuwait, which is a smaller nation to its south, and quickly, of course, seize its rich oil fields. The motives of Saddam Hussein, Iraq's military dictator, were quite mixed. Like most Iraqis, he believed that Kuwait was once part of the Ottoman Empire, and so it rightfully belonged to the Iraqis. Okay, he also wanted access to ports on the Persian Gulf. Iraq is a landlocked nation. Of course, the U.S. responds swiftly to news of the invasion. Its first concern was that Saddam Hussein might also attack Saudi Arabia, which the U.S. had defined as vital to its interests as far back as the 1940s. On August 15th, 1990, President Bush orders U.S. forces to Saudi Arabia and the Persian Gulf, calling the action, quote, Operation Desert Shield. The U.S. leads a broad coalition of nations, all right, including the Soviet Union. Now, in early November of 1990, President Bush announces a change in policy to what he calls an offensive military operation. Administration officials begin to demonize Saddam Hussein as another Adolf Hitler. The UN sanctions fail to budge Hussein, all right, from Kuwait, and now the drift toward war looks inevitable. In January of 1991, Congress narrowly passes a joint resolution authorizing the president to use military force. All right, after a last-minute U.S. peace mission fails to break the deadlock, President Bush announces on January 16th, 1991, the start of what's called Operation Desert Storm. So it goes from Desert Shield to Desert Storm. U.S.-led airstrikes begin 42 days of massive bombing of Iraqi positions in Kuwait, as well as Baghdad and other Iraqi cities. The ground war, which begins on February 24th, only takes 100 hours to force Saddam's troops out of Kuwait. Hussein's vaunted military machine, which was the fourth largest in the world at that point, turns out to be surprisingly weak. Now, U.S. forces only lose 184 dead compared to nearly 100,000 Iraqi deaths, mostly from bombing. Victory in the Gulf rekindles national pride in America. It shucks off what becomes known, or what is known as Vietnam Syndrome. For the 18 million people of Iraq, it produces the worst possible outcome, all right? The ecological damage in the Gulf region is extensive and long-lasting. Oil fires burn out of control. Human rights groups report appalling death tolls amongst civilians. Now, the limits of military power to solve complex political and economic disputes becomes really clear in the aftermath of victory. The Persian Gulf War fails to dislodge Saddam, who remains in power, all right? Iraqi Kurds, who had supported the U.S. invasion there in the north in hopes that it would topple Saddam, face violent reprisals, including gassings and uses of chemical weapons, okay? The repercussions of the Gulf War are long-lasting. The leading U.S. ally in the region, the oil-rich kingdom of Saudi Arabia, let me show you some pictures there. There's Saddam. Here's a picture of what becomes known as Hell's Highway. To end this, Saudi Arabia was used as a launching point for the Iraqi invasion. After the war, American troops were allowed to stay there to the resentment of some Muslims, one of which was Osama bin Laden, okay? In the 1990s, bin Laden begins to build a shadowy terrorist organization known as Al Qaeda, or the Base, training small groups in terror tactics to be used against Western interests, particularly to force American troops out of the Middle East. So I'm going to stop there. I'm going to leave more slides up after this one, including those pertaining to Bill Clinton, all right, who was elected in 92 and 1996, and George Bush, who was elected in 2000 and 2004, and President Obama, who was elected in 2008. But I'm not going to talk about it because I can't do anymore. Long story short, good luck on Friday on your test. I will see you this week. Have a good night.